Thanks very much. As a user researcher, this topic, great user research for non-researchers, this is an exciting topic to be talking about. Many researchers, we have some concerns about what happens when other people go out and work with users. Ultimately, though, we want to empower everyone to do well. We don't want to be the user research police. At least I hope that's what you're finding where you work. The demand for research, it exceeds the supply of researchers right now. And besides that, there are so many benefits when everyone is involved in research, when research is, as it's being referred to now, democratized. A colleague has begun referring to both researchers and people who do research, which she abbreviates PWD Are. So this talk is about trying to quickly level up PWD Are. So I will talk about three areas: planning research, doing research, and acting on research. So ultimately, our goal is learning from customers. And I'd encourage you to think about that in the broad sense. So go further than, is the product we're making usable? Or do people like the thing that we're making? There's many more questions that you can ask and many more things that you can learn that will inform not only what you build, but also everything that you do as a business. So take some planning time to identify your business question. What is your challenge? And your research objective. What is the information that will drive action on that business question? This is before you get to the specific questions that you'll ask participants. These are three very different things, and you may find yourself starting with any one of the three, but make sure in planning that you flesh out the other two. Make sure you have business question, research objective, participant question, and think about how they're interdependent. I talked with a UX manager who was so frustrated by her organization's eager approach to what she called test all the things. For many people that I encounter, testing seems to be the overarching term for any kind of user research. Sometimes testing is an overall mindset that we think about in how users are involved in what we're doing. I mean, testing is a type of user research, but it's not the only one. We are seeking to deeply understand behavior, needs, meaning, desires. And we're not just validating. We're not just looking at the product. We're not just looking at the solution. It's about the people and deeply understanding them. There are many methods. You can see this amazing table from Christian Rohr. It's part of this excellent paper that describes which methods are best for which situations. There should be a tweet coming out with this URL if you don't get it right now. It's not an exhaustive list of every possible method. The thing about researchers, and you find the more research you do, we're always making up new methods. That's part of sort of the expanding palette we have to draw from. But I think if this is new or something you're learning, keep in mind there's a framework here that Christian describes in this paper for considering methods and choosing, whatever your, quote, best approach is. It's contingent on clarity around that business question that I mentioned earlier. You don't need to think of your research as only looking at the people who are already using your product. I think this is a key point here, you may want to build for someone who is different than who you choose to go out and learn from. So for example, you may want to go learn from lead users. Those is not who you're going to go build for necessarily. But the things that you learn from lead users, they may illustrate, by contrast, the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of constraints that maybe your typical customer is likely to have. And by learning from lead users, you gain a new perspective on the people you want to build for. But also keep in mind that a lot of work that we look at, a lot of things that we want to understand and build to support, it's part of a system. And even if you aren't selling to the entire system, those other nodes in the system, those are other people. They have an impact on what the needs are for who you're going to be selling to or providing tools for. They have an impact on what success looks like. So a simple example is work that I did recently, some research. We were trying to inform a new way of delivering surgical technology into the OR. And so we talked to surgeons with lots of different specialties. But we also talked to OR administration. We talked to scrub techs. We talked to first assistant nurses and the departments that order and clean supplies in order to understand the implication of my client's new design from many different points of view. We do a lot of our everyday work over Hangout or Zoom. So hey, why not do research the same way, right? It's less effort, it's faster, and it's cheaper. But if you do that, you're missing out on so much. You will see things in people's environments that you don't know you need to see and that you will not see over a computer screen. You'll have a rapport with your participant that you cannot achieve mediated through digital bits. And you will be changed by taking the measured risk of leaving your comfort zone, literally, and going into someone else's space. If you can't do this with every person that you talk to, at least try to go out and see physically in meet space some of your users. All right, so let's talk now about doing the research. So when asking questions, specific questions are better than general questions. How do you typically choose a contractor? Is a hard question to answer. It presumes that the person you're talking to, your participant, it presumes that they have a set of practices in place, and if they don't, they might make up something in order to address your question. So instead, ask them about the last time they started a project and how they chose a contractor in that specific instance. And then ask about whether or not that example they just shared with you represents a pattern. That way, it's easier for someone to give you a more reliable answer. You start with a specific, and then you build up to a general. In this particular episode of Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Broken Record, there's a couple of really great extensions to this principle. So there's a point in this podcast, several in fact, where someone gives a very vague answer. It's a statement like, oh, it doesn't work for me. So Gladwell follows up with a specific example. Can you give me a specific example of how it doesn't work for you? Another point in the podcast, people describe a process they go through, but they're very vague in their description. So Gladwell asks them to show him what that looks like. So in both these cases, there's a principle here. Ask follow-up questions to get to specifics when the answers to your question start off as general. Yeah, bad practice that many people default to is putting the answers in the question. So the good question would be, what happens to that package when it arrives? But the bad practice is to say, what happens to that package when it arrives? Do you open it, or do you move it to the other room, or do you send it to this other department? Or maybe you've heard yourself do that. The or is kind of the telltale. It's the trailing off of the question. This is, however, a really hard habit to break. And if you may not even think you need to break the habit, you might think, well, the participant can just simply say, oh, what I do is not included in any of the examples. It's none of those, actually. But if you think that, you're underestimating how much power you have when you are doing research. Because eventually, a participant will reflect back the framework that you give them. Because for the participant that you're doing research with, they want to do a good job. So this, for you, the question asker, this is very hard to stop doing. It's something to pay attention to and to keep practicing. The naive approach to building rapport with someone that you're interviewing is thinking that you can connect with someone by telling them the ways that you are just like them. But that takes the focus away from the participant. The best practice, and it may go against your instincts, is to hold off on that reaction. When you hear something where you think, oh yeah, I'm the same as that person, you don't have to say anything about it. Hold off on that reaction and keep asking them questions. The focus on them is what builds rapport. So if you need to, if you choose to, you can very occasionally and very calmly reveal something about your own perspective or your own experience if you need to normalize something that they are hesitant or uncomfortable about sharing. That's the time to talk about yourself. Otherwise, make it about them and just keep yourself out of it. If participants start asking questions like, will the next version have the Search Console integrated? Do not answer them. Once you do that, then you become the expert. And it's almost impossible at that point to return back to research mode where they're the expert and you're the one who's interested and curious. Now, these questions are going to come up. So the thing that you can control is how you handle that. So one thing you can do is use the standard research deflection and turn it around. Well, why is that important to you? Now, that may feel too direct, maybe even confrontational. So you can soften it a little bit like this. And so someone says, will the next version have the Search Console integrated? And you say, I'm going to act like a researcher and turn that back around to you and ask, why is that important to you? So if you need to sort of point to your behavior as a way to justify flipping it around, as a way to kind of soften it, go ahead and do that. Either way, do not answer those questions. The interview is almost over once you start doing that. It's kind of the world's most expensive sales call or tech support call at that point. In addition to people, you're going to hear them mispronounce the name of your company. You'll also hear them wish for features that you actually do have in your product or in your service. Same principle. Do not interrupt the interview to explain your product to them. Again, the interview is mostly going to be over if that's what you do. So just keep quiet. Sometimes we say, sit on your hands. And acknowledge if this is going to be hard for you to do that, just acknowledge ahead of time, oh, if I hear this, I'm going to really have a hard time. You absolutely have to sit on your hands here. Because otherwise, again, same principle here, you make yourself the expert. So at the end, when you're all done, you can tell them anything that would help them. But it isn't a chance to evangelize your new feature or encourage them to do what you're hoping that they would do. It's only for something they need help with. So do it very sensitively. You mentioned you were looking for some video tutorials. Would you like me to show you where those are? Social scientists talk about natural language, the way that people in certain groups refer to things. And sometimes the local terminology may vary from yours. So as you learn these terms from participants, reflect that language in the way that you word your questions. And don't try to be cool and presume shorthand that they haven't shared with you. Like if someone mentions National Geographic, don't follow up with Nat Geo. Use the language that they use. And again, same principles here. It reinforces that they're the experts. that you're curious about their perspectives. It can take a while to generate a sense of rapport, of comfortable back and forth when you're doing research with somebody. And it depends on you, it depends on that person, it depends on the day. It might take 10 seconds, or it might take 10 minutes, it might take 45 minutes. You have to be patient. But remember this visualization where the interview eventually moves from question, answer to question, story. Just because that person isn't effusive right away, give them a chance to be comfortable with you. And you don't let yourself get too uncomfortable if things feel awkward for a while. Just keep asking questions. And you should definitely have a list of questions prepared, but most of the questions that you actually ask, the things that you say, and the way that you say them should be emergent. It should follow from what the person has said. You'll need to follow up lots of times to get clarity, to get more detail, to get to a point where you understand what it is they're trying to tell you. And so when you go back to something from before, tell them, I want to go back to something that you said before. When you change topics, tell them that you're changing topics. Say, okay, I'm going to switch gears here, and maybe we can talk about planning out budgets now. This reinforces that you're paying attention and what they're telling you is important and you want to know more about it, and that you're partnering with them in this conversation and you're making sure that they're on board when tracking with you where it's headed. So this is something that really increases the comfort. When it comes to showing prototypes, I find a lot of teams default to taking their design process artifacts and testing them, and missing the opportunity to create new things to show that in the field that are not part of what you're planning to build, but are tangible, experiential, visible artifacts that people can play with or react to as a way to provoke a deeper reflection on the underlying issues that you want to understand. So imagine this ridiculous flip phone. You aren't going to make this product, but you could use this artifact to show someone as a way to have a different conversation about form factor, about losing the device, about interacting with the keypad, and so on. Here's a stealth shot I took on board an airplane where the people in front of me, a couple of rows, had rigged up an iPhone holder using the plastic bag from the blankets. They made a sling and they jammed it into the tray table hook. This is a great example of a satisfice, or a good enough solution. And satisfice, if it's a word you haven't heard before, it comes from the word satisfy and suffice. Satisfice. And it's an important concept when doing research. People have a high tolerance for good enough solutions. And when we see satisficing in the field, we sometimes decide, oh, it's an opportunity. And sometimes it is, right? Some aircraft interiors now have clips on the seat back where you can mount your device during the flight. But sometimes it isn't. People will continue to put up with a non-ideal solution. So you can think about the cost of tolerating an existing compromise versus the cost, the financial cost, the cognitive cost, the switching cost of adopting a new solution. If the cost is zero, like it's in the seat back already, then sure. If the cost is higher, like it's something the traveler has to learn about, purchase, pack, then maybe this is just fine for them. So if you're thinking about the behavior change required, that's better than just rolling out new fixes because you can. Try to see what people are doing as something that works well enough for them. Mechanically, given how fast people talk and how fast you can type or write, you can't take notes well enough. You need a recording that is complete and an accurate document of the interview. Your notes are biased based on what you heard and interpreted, so take notes as a way to process information in real time, but you need a recording as the official capture of what was actually said. Yeah, people get jammed up worrying about biases, and it's easy to see why. There's so many of them. But my advice is to work on hearing your own bias. When you have those moments of being wrong, to reframe it so that uncovering your own judgment is joyful, it's freeing, it's liberating. So you go from I was wrong to I am learning. So apply that approach to any moment in a research session. And this is a skill to build, obviously, in life in general, right? To be excited about being wrong. We talk about empathy a lot, as we should, but for research, it's specifically important because it's how you do the work. You're trying to understand the contours of someone else's perspective and experience that differs from yours. Well, that's what it takes to do research. I mean, this is really what you're trying to learn in the first place. So being judgmental, as we learned this morning, is a very human thing, and it gets in the way. So we all do it. So what'd you think when you saw that iPhone sling? What will you think when you see that from one of your customers, one of your participants? So to confront our own judgments, first learn to hear yourself making those judgments. And then ask yourself the question. Question it. Maybe that isn't true. If you can get more data to flesh out a new conclusion, that's great. But even if you don't, I think even challenging your own judgment is a way to open yourself up to the kind of revelations that we're seeking. So these two emotions, empathy and judgment, are tied together. They're in adjacent regions of the brain. And so here's an amazing life hack for when you're feeling judgmental and maybe judgmental and angry. You can do this anytime, doesn't have to be in research. I was traveling recently, and I had this long morning walk to go meet my friends, and I was late, and I was hurrying, and I was just grumpy, and I went through a park, and here's a bunch of people getting off a tour bus and kind of crowding around and getting in my way, and I was so annoyed, and I was like really critical of these people, and I passed along this 3-generation family where the mom was trying to pose people to take a picture, and I happened to make eye contact with her, and I gestured that I could take a picture of them. So just wordlessly, they gave me the camera, and they posed, and I took a vertical and a horizontal picture, and I handed the camera back, and they expressed so much gratitude. But the thing here is, I felt so much better, okay? Beyond being a good person in the world, that is not the point of the story. The point of the story is extending empathy to other people makes us feel better. Finally, there's brain science that tells us that stress limits our empathy. So manage research projects in a way that's reasonable. Not too many sessions. Make sure you have breaks. Make sure you plan for whatever's going to stress you out. Your logistics, your technical stuff that you're showing, your driving directions, all those things. All right, last section here is about acting on the research that we've done. Some people seem to think that once you talk to people, then you write up the key takeaways from each person, throw it into a deck, and you're done. But that is insufficient to get the full value out of research. We talk about insights, but insights are not something that you simply gather and tabulate. They're the outcomes of a process. And if you want to get beyond the obvious, right, literally the things that people told you they want you to put in your product, you have to go through this process. It's a combination of analysis and synthesis. So analysis is the first part. It's breaking larger pieces down into smaller ones, like pulling key anecdotes out of an interview. Synthesis is combining smaller pieces up into something larger. So anecdotes become themes, they become frameworks. It is very time-consuming, but the more you put in, the more you get out. Some people plan for 2 to 3 hours of analysis and synthesis for every hour they spend doing research. So here's one approach. Look at a transcript, mark different parts of what the participants said based on the issues and concerns they suggest. So you go person by person and see what each person articulates. That's analysis. Then you take all of those issues you've identified and you put them together into a larger framework that includes the patterns and your concluding point of view about them. That's synthesis. A shortcut is to look for the meanings of words that people use. They tell us things in research, and we might assume that they're using the word the same way that we are, especially if it's a technical term like reporting. Oh, we think we know what that is. A solution, we think we know what that is. But look closely at what they said and what you assumed they meant from the larger context of the conversation, and then you can identify how they're using the term. Sometimes when you feel surprised or confused by the words they're using, that's a cue to look more closely. So example, when you hear the phrase power trip, you might have a certain interpretation in mind, but then you see the sign and you have a different interpretation. Those are the kind of things to pay attention to. There's a lot more in this post. I tweeted this post by John Kolko. It's kind of an operational recipe. It's not about how to derive meaning from what people say and don't say, but it's kind of the structure and operations of the analysis and synthesis process. Also, to make sense of the research, go back to where you started, what you heard from stakeholders, because they shared with you their assumptions about what the problem is, what the need is, and what the solution is. Sometimes I'll do exceptionally in-depth, I guess I'll call it, in-depth research with stakeholders before I talk to any customers or any users, because there's so much value in coming up with a result that says, here's the gaps. You said this, users said that. This is really what we need to understand as an organization in order to move forward. Yeah, for researchers, there's a very familiar response, which is this dismissive, oh, we already knew that. And you may hear this pushback when you share what you discovered. But you really got to ask your audience something. You got to challenge them. Really? Did you? Something being familiar or feeling true is not the same as knowing it. Recognition is not recall. And beyond that, confirmatory findings are okay. There's a lot of reasons why research results get rejected, and one is it's uncomfortable to have to change your mind. So at best, it's inconvenient. So be a little aware of what your audience, your stakeholders are going through, and approach your interaction with them around that kind of change appropriately. So just to wrap up, I'll point you to 3 different resources for more on user research. Dollars to Donuts, as Martin mentioned, is a podcast. The people I interview in that podcast are leading in-house research teams. It's a role we didn't have a few years ago. And so check out what all sorts of different organizations and different kinds of leadership. Interviewing users, lots of, if you go to the URL, you can not only buy the book, but there's lots of resources there. And Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries is a book of stories of 65 different researchers around the world about what happens when we leave our comfortable, safe space and go out into the world and encounter real people where they're at, and what do we learn from doing that. So that's all for me. Please keep in touch. Thanks for your time.